Hi, so today's verse is from Ephesians chapter 2, and it starts in verse 14. It says, "For he himself is our peace." And it goes on to say, "By setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations." His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And when it talks about the two, it's talking about a peace between Jews and Gentiles. And so this is talking about non-Jews being able to enter into fellowship with God through Jesus' sacrifice. But then it talks about setting aside the law. For he himself is our peace. And that peace comes about partly by setting aside in his flesh the law. So what does that mean, setting aside the law? In Matthew, Jesus said that he came to fulfill the law. He said that not one jot or tittle, that's kind of like saying not one dot of the I or cross of the T would pass away from the law. And then 2 Timothy says that all Scripture is God-breathed and that it is useful for teaching, rebuking, and training in righteousness. So those two verses, which say that the law is going to stand forever and that all Scripture is good for teaching, seems like it contradicts what this says, that Jesus will set aside the law. So how does that work? What does that mean? How do we interpret that? Well, the way that we interpret it is that Jesus fulfilled all the requirements of that Old Testament covenant, all the Old Testament laws, through his sacrifice. So the law is still there, the law is still in effect, but it's fulfilled by Jesus. So he didn't, it didn't go away, but it's still there. But then there's still questions about this, and this is a tough topic that no one fully understands or can know, but this is my understanding of it through some studying. There's still some things in the Old Testament that if all Scripture is good for teaching, rebuking, and training, then how, and that is talking specifically about the Old Testament in 2 Timothy, then how do we interpret the Old Testament laws, some of them very archaic laws about, for example, not mixing different types of thread when you're making clothes? I'm breaking that law right now. I'm pretty sure this is a blended fabric. Or not mixing seeds when you sow seed. How does that, or eating pork or shellfish, or the lots of those laws that we don't follow these days. So how do we reconcile that with not one jot or tittle of the law being passing away, and all Scripture is good for teaching? And this is how there are different ways of interpreting it. One way is that some people will say that there are different categories of laws. One is ceremonial laws and the other is moral laws, and then the ceremonial laws are ones that were only relevant under the Old Covenant. Laws about how to perform sacrifices, laws about what you can and can't eat to be ceremonially clean. And then there are moral laws, like don't commit adultery, don't kill, that are still in effect. And that's one way that people interpret it. Another way, and I think I lean more towards this second viewpoint, but it's something that I'm still developing in my own personal theology, is that all of those laws are undergirded by some type of absolute and eternal truth. For example, the law about not eating fish, or the law about not wearing blended fabrics, perhaps one of the undergirding or underlying principles of that points to the holiness of God and how we are to revere Him as pure. Again, I don't know exactly. If I think no one has it exactly right, but we have to go by what we read in the Scripture, and by reading that all Scripture is good for teaching and training and rebuking and correction, and I have to take that, that's pretty clear, that's not confusing, so I have to take that clear Scripture and try to use that to understand Scripture that maybe isn't quite as clear. But the bottom line for this passage is that either way, however we look at the law, however we compare Old Testament law and New Testament covenant, is that, just like we discussed yesterday, Jesus brings peace. And he put in place a new covenant so that not only the Jewish people could have and experience his peace, but under the new covenant, anyone is able to do that. And that's what we need to be thankful for and understand, first of all, and then after we've got that clear in our minds, then maybe go back and take a look at some of these more complicated things in Scripture.